afternoon and welcome to Helvetica, Typography and Literacy. I'm Francis Levy and Ed Nursesi and I are the co-directors of the Philoctetes Center. So I used this metaphor last time, or metaphor image, like the proud and complacent battleship which sits in the harbor. We were hit by a torpedo. A lot of you have read about it. And it's been amazing, the response we've gotten. So many people have sent in checks, large checks, small checks. A foundation, without even asking us, sent us a rather substantial sum. But in order to make this place work, we have all kinds of expenses. And we have PayPal on the site now, so you can just, if you feel like it and you've come across some money that you would like to push in this direction, you can do it through PayPal. You can write checks that are mailable to Philoctetes, and we are mighty appreciative. I'm so appreciative. It's sort of in the face of this kind of negative side of the human spirit, the fact that people believe in something and want us to do this makes me want to do everything I can to do it. So I'm putting my own money in. I did before, but I'm putting whatever money I have into it. And other people here on staff have done the same thing. So, we really want to make this thing go. And the other thing is that we have a number of different programs here. We have a journal that you've seen we publish, and we are looking for people who will fund varying aspects, like the videography enables us to stream this on the internet. It's simulcast, as you know, and then all the programming of Philoctetes is here archived, so scholars use it, people all over the world use it now. It will always be there, but we'd like to continue. And our videographer, Miguel, is amazing. He's just doing this at much less than the normal budget, and he's editing for free. So all these people, I really thank you. I thank everybody. Now, before we go on with today's panel, this is a couple of other announcements. The show you see, Typography, has been put together by Cohen, our curator, and she's the head of the art department at Marymount, and Adam Ludwig. And so take a look at the show. A lot of times people come in and they go to the Roundtable, they don't see what's on the walls, and that's an important ingredient of what goes on in the Philoctetes Center. Tomorrow, we have a roundtable on literacy, and it's a perfect tie-in with typography. I call typography the muse of literacy because it sounded right, but it makes no sense at all. Anyway, Steve is the moderator tonight, and I was going to give this the usual, introduction, but really the key thing about Steve is that he was a wonderful parent at the Greenwich Village Little League, and that's how we first met. He had a son, and then in the basketball.
Is that true?
It's true. You were a wonderful parent and kibitzer. You got the kibitzing award. That's how we became friends many years ago. But Steve is also the director of the graduate program in design at Visual Arts, and this one book of his, Iron Fist, he's written about 100, right? More than 100? Yeah. Iron Fist, Branding the Totalitarian State, which is published by Taschen. Am I correct about that? No. Who publishes it? Phaidon. It's similar, right?
Yeah. They both have ends at the end.
Okay. Steve Heller, I just introduced before, and Steve is going to introduce our other panelists.
Thank you, Frank. Although I'd rather listen to you. Always. I thank Frank for inviting me here. This is the third roundtable I've been to, and I'm going to come until I can pronounce Philoctetes. I don't know why he made something such a tongue teaser, and never mind.
It's the death rattle of literacy.
The death rattle, that's good. We're going to talk about typography, and typography, I think, to everybody around this table, lettering, letter forms, type, is a passion. And I believe that one can say, even though we're talking about a vessel of language and meaning, we are indeed passionate about it. And as you probably saw in Gary's film, people can get really emotional and angry over type, and even the way it's spaced. So we're going to talk about individuals who work with and use typography and what it means to them. What we're going to do today is go around the panel and have each participant talk to some images that they brought with them. And then we're going to have some Q&A, and hopefully all of you in the audience can chime in. I'm going to make very brief introductions. There is a more detailed biography available for you. Gary has been sitting here patiently. You saw his amazing movie. He also has a film that will be released this summer called this spring, called Objectified, which is a a documentary on made objects and industrial design. Elaine Lustig Cohen. Elaine has been toiling in the art and design biz for an awful long time, but is a wonderful resource for a great many artifacts and knowledge about early modernism, American modernism. Her former husband, Alvin Lustig, was one of the great modernists, and she and I are working on a biography about him. She is also a collagist as well as a typographer, but today she'll be talking about her typography. Next to her is Rem Duplessis, who is the art director of the New York Times magazine section, one of the most beautifully designed magazines today, as magazines are beginning to flit away into the digital miasma. It's great to have that Sunday publication every Sunday, or Saturday if you get home delivery, and look at the wonderful work, both photographically, typographically, and illustratively, that Rem is involved in. Christopher Calderhead is a lettering artist and an author and an educator, and his own work involves lettering and various media. His photographs are on the wall from Letters from New York, a series of books that he's been working on. And next to him is Elinor Holland, who has studied religion and Arabic at the University of Pennsylvania. She is a calligrapher and works with the traditional methods of calligraphy. And when she sent me her images, I was just so taken by what I saw, the nexus of Arabic and our writing, English writing. So what we're going to do, I'm going to just give you a little brief rundown of the history of type in 3 seconds. You got a pretty good history from the Helvetica movie, from the voices of people who make the type and who have changed the way we look at things through type. But I just want to review that for a second. And type has always been supposedly seen but not heard, but that's never true. It's seen and heard. It's meant to be loud. It's meant to express. And these are typefaces that were used for window displays and other signage at the turn of the century, this being from an Austrian type catalog. As you can see, there's a variety of forms and a variety of styles, and they are very architectonic in their own right, entertaining in their own right, beautiful, and they reflect other aspects of the culture, furniture, fashion, etc. This is a specimen sheet that would be used by a sign painter at the turn of the century. These are called bifurcated Latins, and you might look at these and think of them as Victorian, and from that Victorian era they represent or recreate the kind of scroll work that you see in a lot of Victorian architecture. Art Nouveau was an important part of the shift towards modernism in 1896 and beyond for about 12 years. It was called Floriated Madness, and it was a reversion to a kind of naturalistic way of looking at type and typography, and this is one of the great title pages from Iki Homo, designed by Henry van Velde, who later went on to be the first director of the Bauhaus. This is the kind of everyday type, the kind of workhorse type. In fact, it's not even given a name except wood type. These were types that were very durable, very loud, and you would find on most posters and railroad station signs and newspaper headlines as well. This is what's called show card writing. It was a pretty good profession back in the early part of the century. You learned how to do it through correspondence school books. Anybody who had an unshaky hand can do these things and make $5 to $10 in your spare time producing signs for the local emporia. This is what I call typographica parlante. There's something called architecture parlante, which is a building that looks like the function that it was designed for or made for, and typography works in that same way. We would never know, of course, that this was for freeze-proof whatever, if not for the icicles. And I feel that this should be making a big comeback soon. This is black letter type. As some of you who are type aficionados know, there was a split between the Roman letter and the black letter, and this was a publication, a typographic news from Germany, from Leipzig, which is where printing had its center in Germany in the 20s and teens and before. And what I show this for is not just to show you the black letter, which you know is Fractor or Old English at times, but to show you how in the same year, 1925, it went from this to this. Which is Jan Tschichol's cover and issue, special issue of the magazine called Elementary Typography, in which he introduces the modernist typographers and their rejection of the kind of ornament and the old antiquarian bourgeois ideas of typography. These were very political times, and sometimes the politics came out in the typography. Hitler, of course, returned to the black letter when he took power, and he called it Volk lettering. This is what was part of that issue of Elementary Typography. It's the El Lissitzky-Mayakovsky book, For the Voice, and this was a radical way of reading. This, going to the title of today's event, looking at literacy, this is how literacy was brought to many people in post-Soviet or post-revolutionary Russia. And that kind of led to designs that were being done. It influenced, the modern vocabulary influenced an awful lot that was going on in this country and others, as you saw in Gary's film. This is designed by Herbert Matter, the New Haven Railroad logo, which is still in use and based on a constructivist, Russian constructivist principle. Then you move into the Swiss design that was discussed in Gary's film, and this is Joseph Müller-Brockmann using Helvetica to great or accidents grotesque. I always confuse the two. Using accidents grotesque to great effect. Very simple typography, doing away with all the ornamentation that was so much a part of the 19th and early 20th century. This is a book called, well, I forget what it's called, but it was by Brown, John, Chermayeff, and Geismar, and it's using type in to evoke puns, and psychoanalysis is there because we're here in this place. Blotto works very well. I didn't know for many years what the bottom one was. Can anybody figure out what telesopovisuberinian is?
Commercials.
Exactly. It took me years. And then my 5-year-old son pointed it out to me. Going along in the Swiss, with the Swiss school, this is Armin Hoffman, and he was experimenting. David Carson wasn't the only person to experiment with type. Every typographer at every different stage of type, even the more rationalist type, were experimenting to see the levels of legibility and readability and how far you could push letter forms. And this means graphic design. It's a poster for an exhibition. Retro comes back in the late 50s or early 60s, where passé type forms from the 19th century, from the early part of the 20th century, are brought together again, both as a comment on the modernist creed that was so popular at the time, but also as a way to enliven the visual landscape. And this was a magazine edited by Victor Navasky and designed by Phil Gips. And then we move into psychedelia. Massimo talked about psychedelia. While this is not Victor Moscoso, who was one of the founders of the psychedelic lettering movement, he studied with Joseph Albers at Yale. And Albers said, don't make type colors vibrate and don't make type that you can't read from 10 feet away. So going back home, Moscoso took a little drag on his weed and said, nope, I'll make type that vibrates and color that vibrates and type that you can only read from 2 inches away. We move from there into the punk scene, where type is not even important. Lettering isn't even important. It's just get whatever message out you can get out, so the ransom note comes into play. And now we move into David Carson. And basically, in the beginning, as he said, there were lots of mistakes that were made, and that became something that people wrote many long-winded essays about. A lot of what he was doing in the early days was taking a new machine and playing with all of its defaults and all of the possibilities of mistakes that could be made with the machine. And so you get headlines that are multiple-sized letter forms and letter spacing that goes all which way. At the same time, there are lots of movements in typography. There are some people who prefer the old and the old-fashioned, and there are some people that want to look totally at the future. And this is Charles Spencer Anderson, who did the identity in the early years for Turner Classic Movies, and some of that is still going on today. Lettering is now such a digital process that even the great typeface designers like Matthew Carter works primarily on a screen and not on paper. And so there are a number of designers, graphic designers and illustrators, who are going back to the hand, the real digits, the real digital media. This is Johnny Hanna taking his little cue from the Victorian typeface phenomena. And then, as Stefan Sagmeister told you, there are all different ways to skin a cat and to tattoo Lou Reed. And hand lettering now is just as significant as drawn lettering, drafting, and digital lettering. So I'm going to leave you with that little overview of type. And we're going to go to Christopher. And Chris, since you're there and I'm here, just tell me when you want me to turn.
Okay. So this is a magazine that I did for the Friends of Calligraphy in San Francisco. It's a journal that came out 3 times a year called Alphabet. And when working out this logo, one of the things I wanted to do was really play with the letters, because this is for lettering people. So I started with old wood type, a nice condensed wood typeface that I found. Rendered all of the letters and spaced them properly, and then reversed them, and then began taking out as much of the negative space as I could, leaving just those elements that would still let you read the word. About half of the membership of the Friends of Calligraphy were never able to read the word. But people who loved it, loved it. People who hated it really loathed it.
No in between.
No in between, absolutely not. So that's a cover from Alphabet. And my training originally was in classical calligraphy. I studied in England with Anne Camp. And in my magazine, Letter Arts Review, in this current issue that's just about to hit the stands, I did an editorial about the fact that people just don't use their hands anymore. And when I teach a workshop, about 1/3 of students don't even know how to use a ruler. And I'm talking about adults who ordinarily can do all sorts of things. They cannot find 1/8 of an inch. And so I begin a calligraphy workshop with, let's discuss the ruler. And even when I do that, I can guarantee that 3 people will be using picas and 2 people will do 1/16 of an inch. So it's amazing that we just don't use our hands.
And that goes for handwriting as well, right?
Yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. So this is something I wrote as a piece of artwork for the issue, because I just enjoy the physical feel of the ink going down on the page, and I wanted to do something with that.
Do you find that more people have become interested in calligraphy, or is it's an arcane act?
It's still fairly arcane. Yeah, I'd say it's arcane. The calligraphy movement really sort of burst on the scene in the 70s, 80s. There was a huge burst of interest. And a whole bunch of us who got involved at that point have been getting older and older. And there are not a lot of youngsters coming into it. However, I am offering an introduction to calligraphy these days, and it packs every time. So maybe there is a revived interest. Now, my practice is all over the lot. So this is a sign I did for my corner bodega. Ali on the corner asked me, could you do me a sign that says breakfast? And I'd actually never painted a real outdoor sign before. So I called up friends of mine to say, well, what kind of paint do you use and what do you do? So figured out one shot is the paint. And did this, and it hangs on the corner. And so I take pleasure seeing it every time I go for my own breakfast. Another local store, this is in Astoria, where I live, is the Brick Cafe. And they wanted to redo their sign over the awning. So this is my first sketch. When I'm doing things, they're going to be large scale. I almost always start with a very tight pencil sketch. So this is my tight pencil sketch. And this is the sign actually being put up. So you can see that the original sign that I'm replacing, which is up at the top, was done by an amateur. It was just a friend of the owner's. And actually it's kind of nice in its own quirky little way. But I made it a lot bolder and chunkier. I was going to paint this by hand, but in the end the owner found some local store that was going to print it out. So I did the whole thing in Illustrator. Which made it very simple.
Just out of curiosity, why the emphasis on the yellow?
I just picked up the colors from the facade. The rest of the place is all very brick red. And so the yellow is their contrast color. And the bottom was not going to change. So I just picked that up from what was there. Now can we go back? And then this is another piece for the Brick Cafe. People kept stealing the signs in the men's room. Why they want to steal those cheap plastic signs, I don't know. They have not stolen my signs, which almost offends me. But the owner asked me if I would just paint things directly on the mirrors and directly on the walls. So once again, this is the kind of stuff that's just tied into community. And so I'm using my skill to help people that I know in my own community who know me. And this is some of the work that I get the most pleasure out of doing.
Why would they ask you to do something as professional as this when they could do it themselves?
I don't know, actually. I mean, they see me doodling on napkins at the bar, so they know I can do this. And I don't think they would have been able to actually do it. I mean, I think if you tried it. I had to do it on all sorts of different surfaces. Mirrors, stucco walls that were rough, tiles. So I had to figure out a system that would work across the board. And then I have 3 shots from Letters from New York, which is a series of small books that I do that actually we have on sale out at the table outside. So you can have a look at the actual magazines or books. This was the first one, cut out letters pasted to a wall. And then I did 2 outtakes. This is Letters from New York 2. I always try to take lettering and put it into a New York context, because these are little anthologies of lettering from New York City. So I always find some excuse to do something calligraphic or lettering oriented that looks like it should be out there, something you would see. The lettering here was actually by Karen Sheraton on the posters. And this was an outtake. You can see the one I actually chose for the cover after the program outside. And this is an outtake from Letters from New York 5. I worked with, I had an intern working with me at the time, and we put together this sandwich board and did the shot. And I almost used that, but someone said you can't show someone smoking. So.
Where did you come to study lettering?
I grew up in the city. My father was in advertising. I grew up in the art department, drawing, sketching, using Letraset, sort of surrounded by lettering. And then I went to England for 2 years and studied at Roehampton, which was my classical training in calligraphy and bookbinding. And otherwise, I've just read a lot and done a lot, really on the job.
Great. Okay, we're going to move to Elaine.
Well, I was working, of course, in the, sorry for my voice today. I was working in the 50s and early 60s, long before Helvetica, but we were not poor about typefaces. We had a lot of grotesques, Gothics, and also we had a typeface called Accidents, which they refer to in the movie, which is what Helvetica was based on. The series of book jackets that I was doing were for a publisher of paperbacks. At the time, there was a very small amount of paperback companies who were doing serious books. Sorry. The paperbacks were also nonfiction. They usually had to do with philosophy, history, and so what I tried to do with this whole series is do covers in which I made the type, this was in the beginning, fairly interesting. So in this case, I took a known letter and broke it up and changed the color. Sorry. Yeah.
Was this, I know, and many people do know of your interest in early modernism and constructivism and Dada and the like. Did this have a direct influence there, or was it something more instinctive?
No, I don't think so, because I was always very interested in letters as such, breaking them up, changing them, and in something like this, making it very abstract.
What was this for?
This was when Meridian Books had sold their millionth paperback. And it was sent out to all the bookstores, and I don't remember exactly who. This was like 1957. Seven.
Would you, in looking at this in retrospect, would you say it was 1957, or would
No.
you say there was a...
No,
another?
because, I mean, the one thing that you all forget is that when, in the movie, when you look at these 50s magazines, and Life magazine, which had the most awful ads, and Saturday Evening Post, there were a number of designers who were working in a modern way, and they had all been influenced by earlier people like Lustig, Rodchenko, especially Chicold. It wasn't such a desert as you think, but the difference was it was not for big corporations. And that was the advantage I think I had when I was designing, and that's why I never ended up using lots of Helvetica, because most of my clients were museums, architects. What you're going to see now is a whole series of catalogs that I did for the Jewish Museum in the early 60s. And what I tried to do in these catalogs is really have the type illustrate what was going on inside. And so on the next one, and by the way, I always look at this and say to myself, it is the only time I use Chinese lettering. I always objected to it, but it just happens, and this is the way it always happens, it depends on the letters. In other words, even with a terrible typeface, and this is not Futura, but if you take a terrible typeface like Futura, and you have the right word, the right series of letters, you can make it beautiful. Mm-hmm. You're lucky if the word doesn't have an O, because in Futura, the O kind of, it's lost, right? Anyway, it just happened that these worked vertically. And it goes around to the back cover. And what this was the Jewish Museum organized the Venice Biennale show that year, 1964.
What was the relationship you had with the Jewish Museum? When you came up with a typographic design, was there an overlay of bureaucracy, or was it just...
No, I was working with the director. I was lucky in my design career. I worked always with the director. But that's true of even somebody like Paul Rand. Paul Rand was able to do these things because he worked with Watson at IBM. He didn't have to work with anybody further down.
No second guessing. You
No
only second
second-
guess yourself.
That's right. This was another catalog for the Jewish Museum. This is one of my favorites. This was primary structures, and I wanted to reflect what was going on in the exhibition. It was one of the first exhibitions of really minimal sculpture.
I'm curious, when you illustrate using type, do you draw out the illustration first in a more representational way and then take
Well, I mean, this...
take away the layers?
I don't remember. I mean, it's a long time ago. I didn't have a computer. I would make a sketch. You know, I used to make tiny little sketches with a pencil, and then I'd make it bigger, and then I'd have to do it in ink and draw it out, and it's, you know, time-consuming, old-fashioned. I've only had a computer since 1999, and I haven't been designing really since the late 60s, so that my new work, which is sort of on the walls here, is the same, but it's different in the sense that now what I'm working with are, I call my alphabet poems. They're just about, it's using the alphabet to make a poetry out of them. It's not about a cover or anything like that. This is also, now here, what I'm sure I used was Helvetica press type, and the reason I did was because I could do it on a piece of paper and then photograph it spinning, which actually we didn't use a camera in those days. We would bring it to something called the photostatter. You hold it under the lens and you move it. And this was a show of these two, you know, I'm sure you all know Tingley, you may not know Chauffeur. Eve Klein.
This looks like a monoprint.
Yeah, it was probably a fake monoprint, which, you know, I don't know whether I took cardboard or I really don't remember. Painted on it, pressed it out, and it's all in gold. And then I did all the other ephemeral pieces for the Jewish Museum. This was the Hanukkah. And even when I used a sans serif type like Helvetica, I always tried to make it into something else and not just use it like in 3 lines on white. I always wanted to play with my type. Again. And this is for a publisher called Artist, who were involved in reprinting and publishing Samizdat literature, and they had a magazine called the Russian Tri-Quarterly. And here I tried to reflect what was going on in the Russian constructivist movement.
There are some people who will argue that echoing what went on historically is just pastiche. Do you feel that?
I don't think that's true at all. It depends how you do it. I mean, you can do it like it looks exactly like theirs, or you can turn it into something new. I mean, I don't think anybody looking at this would say it was Rodchenko or Lustig, because it comes through another generation. But I'm sure not everybody would agree with me with that. The one thing I think eventually one should talk about when they talk about typography, and this has not been brought up, is when you are reading a text, which no one, for instance, in the movie, that doesn't even come up. In other words, mostly in the movie, what you see are headline, you know, or
Display.
all right. So My biggest concern, and the thing I think about at the moment, is the whole idea of text on a page. Because I know how I look at it, but because everyone looks at it on the screen today, what will happen to that? When I look at something on the screen, I don't really believe it until I print it out. But that's my generation. Everything on the screen, to me, looks the same. And if I wanted to read a really serious book, I'm not sure I could read it on the screen. So the question is, what will happen to that? And that I don't, I really don't know. But to me, it's also one of the most important typographic problems. The color of the page, the way the type, fits on the page. I don't.
Are you saying, when you say you don't know what will happen to it, you mean what will happen to it in terms of the typography?
Yes, because I think that the people who look at blocks of type on the screen are not going to look at it the same way when they go to design it on a page.
That would affect Kindle also. The fact that
I
Kindle
mean,
is so
that, I don't think, well, yeah, I could read some garbage stuff on that, but I don't think I could read a serious book. Anyway, so.
Good.
Because you don't take it seriously, the Kindle, or because...
No, I would find it disturbing to read it. The light, the way I held it, but...
Because paradoxically, the serious books are very cheap to get on Kindle.
I'm sure.
But also there's an evolutionary process. I mean, when I was a kid, I couldn't read any of the Russian books that I was forced to read when I was in high school because it was Times Roman or something like that, Times Book, and it was just too tight, and I figured I won't have enough time to watch television. By the time I got older and I didn't care about television, I could read those books.
But that's what happens in every generation. It changes. But there's still nothing like a beautiful page printed.
No, there is not.
When I looked at your work, maybe it's because of my age or my time in history, none of it looks dated to me.
Well, thank you.
I could...
Thank you. But I could name about, not a lot, but maybe 10 designers from the late 30s to the 60s who, if I showed you their work, you would say the same thing. So it was mostly, I think, corporate America who were the real evil. And still are.
Hey, nothing changes.
And nothing changes. But there were publishers, there were small industries in which they were doing work that was timeless. And they didn't have Helvetica.
And they weren't trying to be timeless.
And they weren't, no, they weren't.
Okay, let's go to Elinor.
Well, does anybody here read Arabic?
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim.
Very good. Okay, that's excellent. This is a little different, I realize, than everybody else here. This is a classical, it's actually sort of a classical saying that is said by Muslims before you start anything. It's also said before reciting the Quran. So, it's said millions of times by Muslim people all over the world who speak any number of different languages, not just Arabic. So it's very easily recognizable as a form to many people, even who don't know all the individual letters. Okay. All right. That's not me. So this is in a style called muhakkak. And it is a classical form of this phrase. This is a phrase that's been written by the masters many different ways, but this is kind of like a classical piece, much in the way a piece of classical music is written and then repeated by students and other musicians. So I'm repeating this classical form, and I mean that's my marble paper around it. And
The letter forms are one thing, and then there are these lines and curlicues around it. Is that decorative or is that functional?
okay, good question. The little diamonds, the little squares that are turned on their side, you see a few of them. Wish I had a pointer. They are actually part of the letters. They are diacritical marks. They distinguish. There are some letter forms which repeat in Arabic. And you know it's a ba if there's a dot below it. And you know it's a ta if there's two dots above it. Then there are some long strokes. And there's a little thing, I don't know how to describe it, looks like a little double horseshoe. They are actually vowels. So they would tell you how to pronounce it. Then there's a couple other little things which are just extra designs thrown in. If I had a pointer, I could point them out.
And do those things, obviously they don't interfere. They don't make it illegible in any way.
The vowels and the diacritical marks, certainly not. I mean, although anybody probably from anywhere in the Muslim world could read this without the vowels. I mean, it's like the full declension. It's like the complete rendering of that sentence. When it has, could I say it right now? Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. And it's read from right to left.
Is it like Hebrew where you can have it without or with the marks underneath? Or
Pretty, I mean, I don't know how that works in Hebrew because I don't know Hebrew. It's
probably
complex.
the
You
same.
don't always have the vowels. In most books, you wouldn't have vowels if in Arabic. But if
it's
you
the
wanted
vowel.
everything to be absolutely clear,
I see.
you would put the vowels in.
You see the first little like this with the dot under it,
right?
the dot under that thing is what makes that the letter B.
Ah,
Right, so
And
that
then-
you'd have to have.
And then there is a line under that.
right.
If that line is under that, that is a B. If the line was to be above it, it would become a ba.
And if it was a different line,
So
it
it's
would
a
be a
vowel.
boo.
I
Right.
see. Okay.
Would you say that it's easier to do this calligraphically than typographically?
Oh, yeah. Well, first of all, I mean, I'm not a typographer. So for me, yes, definitely. But Arabic calligraphy typographically, I know, is a little complex because the letters join. I mean, I can elaborate more about how the alphabet works. Shall I do that? I mean, there's...
Yeah, let's go to the next picture. and you
Okay. There's this is just a short. This is two words. It's one of the names of God. It's the healer. It's like the invocation of the healer, Ya Shafi, and it's done in a design. It's not. This is calligraphy. This is decorative. This is not just like straight writing by any means. The letters in Arabic connect to each other. So most letters connect on both sides. There are 6 letters that don't connect to the letter before it. Most letter forms, letters will have 4 forms. They'll have an independent form, they'll have an initial form at the beginning of a word, they'll have a medial form, they'll have a final form. There are letter forms that repeat, like ba, ta, tha. So they will be the same form, but with different diacritical marks to distinguish them. So there aren't 28 letter forms. I believe there's 18 letter forms. There's 28 letters in the alphabet that is spoken. But it's complex because they join. They can't not join. If you put independent letters together, I mean, I've seen people do this who don't know. They want to write their name in Arabic. So you just go to the font, you find it. It doesn't work. It doesn't make any sense. So it's complex to have them all joining, mostly because they change shape.
You mentioned this is calligraphy. Can you define calligraphy?
Can I define calligraphy? Christopher's a calligrapher. No.
It's really, I'm working
Well-
on a book on world calligraphy traditions, and one of the real difficult things is to find a definition that works across all the traditions. Because, for instance, square Kufic is not calligraphy
No,
by
square
our
Kufic is not
definition.
calligraphy.
But Arab calligraphers would call it calligraphy.
No, they wouldn't.
Really?
No.
Wissam
no,
Shafat
no.
calls it calligraphy.
Who is that?
Wissam.
Okay, Mohammed Zakaria says it's not calligraphy.
Let's get a fight going.
All right.
I in general can define calligraphy as something that's made with a pen and it's made with strokes. Now there can be a certain amount of touch-up afterward, but it's a stroke made, it's like gestural forms of lettering. So, I mean, there's also an artistic component to it, you know, but I guess that then you'd get into what's good calligraphy, what's bad calligraphy. You know, handwriting is not calligraphy.
Yeah. I think of it as formal writing. It's got to be formal. So in the sense, not in the sense that it's elegant, but in the sense that the form matters. We're concerned with how it looks. But it's writing. It's direct.
Did the ancient scribes do calligraphy?
Yes.
Well, which ancient scribes?
The biblical scribes,
Oh,
scribes that created the Book of Kells.
Oh, yeah, that's definitely
That's
calligraphy. Yeah, yeah. You'd have to go back. I mean, you could discuss whether books in the ancient world, like in the Roman Empire, were calligraphy, because I think they were fairly practical when they were making scrolls. Those were made by slaves. And I think they used very simple forms. I mean, we don't know that much because we don't have that much from
They
them.
were scribes. I mean, there's a difference between a calligrapher and a scribe.
That's
I mean,
true.
a scribe may be a secretary.
Right.
You know, somebody who's just taking notes. I mean, it gets, when you go back historically, you know, when you went to business school 150 years ago, you learned how to write. Some of those people also did it ornamentally, and you could call that calligraphy. Others just took the minutes from the, you know, business meeting. So,
Let's move on.
okay. This is actually on the wall over there. This is a piece of that I did of copying the style of very early Quranic script. People call this Kufic script. The word Kufic is a little complex. It really is referring to sort of a place and an era, because there are many different stylistic scripts that are all called Kufic. But this is a very plain, ancient one.
What does that say?
This is an ayat from the Quran. I guess it's not translated over there. It's the Ayatul Kursi.
It's beautiful.
Thank you.
When I first saw it, when it came in, I was reading it as English, and I was able to
Really?
read it in English.
Wow, what did it say? I'm really...
Beats me, I forgot.
Well, it's actually, I mean, there's some sort of imagery of God sitting on a throne and the whole world kind of being underneath that throne. It's very beautiful, but
I've always been curious how you do the round shapes in that
drawn.
script. It's entirely
it's
drawn.
I mean,
Right.
you're using a broad-edged tool, but what I find interesting is that I made a little circle. It has to have a hole in the middle, the memes and the coughs. So I do that first and then go around, and my teacher, Mohammed Zakaria, does it the opposite.
Huh.
I don't know. So nobody actually knows how that was made in the old times. Bad image. This is just a little saying. Yeah, this is not present. This was sold. This was a saying, sort of a supplication. Again, I mean, a lot of the content I'm getting, because I study with these traditional Turkish masters, I'm getting a lot of spiritual and religious content. And this is kind of a Sufi saying about speaking to God that we do not know you in the full truth of knowing you, the fullness of knowing you. And that's another bad image, but it's my fault. That's there on the wall. This is the first ayat of the Quran that was revealed, according to Muslims, to the Prophet Muhammad. And in it is the mention of the pen. It's ordering the prophet to read, and he didn't know how to read. And it says read. The top line there is actually the Bismillah. So it's like the first slide. It's the same saying. Read in the name of your Lord, who created man from a drop of blood. Read, and your Lord is most generous, who taught man by the pen.
What was the pen in those days? Was it a reed?
I think it was a reed, yeah. I mean, it's the same. It's reeds and
Right, it's the
bamboos, but
same.
reeds are probably easier to come by, I think.
Was the calligrapher in an exalted position? Was it, or is it something that was encouraged for everyone?
Well, you know, different places throughout history it changed, but I think calligraphy was kind of a sign of, it's just kind of ironic, like literacy, like in the Far Eastern tradition. I mean, if you were a fully educated person, you would have studied some calligraphy, you would know the tools. You know, you might keep it up as a hobby.
When I was in school in Tehran, we had to study it. There were special books, and you would take the bamboo, I guess, that would be sharpened specifically, and you would then fill in, because it would be pre-drawn, you would just fill in the ink as a way of improving your handwriting.
Penmanship.
This was just like a title for a course that I was planning to teach that was going to be Latin script calligraphy and Arabic script calligraphy. And this is another logo that never made it, but I was pleased with it for a women's rights organization run by a Syrian lawyer. And so, you know, there's always this problem of combining scripts. And, you know, do you try to accent the differences? Do you try to blend them? There's just different ways of handling it. This is also on the wall. This is done with a pointed pen. Something that I enjoy playing with because it works with pressure. This is one of the differences between typography and calligraphy, is that we use our bodies. And so this kind of pen, although this type of style of script definitely gets looked down upon by calligraphers. You know, you can admit it.
Looked down upon for what reason?
Because people have their invitations to their wedding addressed in, this is called copperplate.
Right.
And it's just sort of,
Although there's also a copperplate typeface.
which is completely,
Quite
everything is, yeah, it's totally different, ironically. The thing is that this is not my favorite style visually, but to actually do it, there's this pressing and releasing, there's kind of a rhythmic motion that is just very enjoyable.
Is that called Spencerian?
Spencerian's
Is
a
that
little
different?
different. It's made with the same kind of tool, but it is a different actual style.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the capitals are heavier and more
I see.
ornate. The lowercase are very light. So this is a version of italic calligraphy done with a broad-edged pen. And these are just, I'm working on a website called Harmony of Line as a way to kind of combine my love of what I discovered is line. It's line. You know, it's letters and it's language, but it's also line.
This also comes very close to bridging the gap between
Right.
calligraphy and script, calligraphy and typography.
And also, I think Latin and Arabic, because Arabic spreads. Arabic has all these horizontal sort of swashes and stretches, and usually Latin, stretches vertically. This is something I did for Christopher for a Society of Scribes calendar. And so it has the alphabet. I believe that our assignment was to have an exemplar of an alphabet of a particular style. So this is copperplate calligraphy. So I have okay, and now we've moved on to just another swashed version of copperplate.
Now, do you get off on the swashes?
What I get off on, should I really be honest?
Yeah.
Is
You're my friend.
when you can do that, when you can develop that lightness of touch, that's fun. Do you know what I mean? Because you're actually doing that, and you have to get this flow kind of going, and that's really fun.
How long did it take you to, assuming you feel you're at a position of mastery, how long did it take?
No, I'm not mastery. Well, it took me, 20 some years to get where I am. I mean, I keep improving, if that's what you mean. It certainly takes a few years of very intense dedication, practicing every day to master a hand. I mean, I really emphasize that every day, some number of hours every day.
Has your hand changed in those 20 years?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
I mean, both physically and...
Oh, I don't know. Physically, yeah, it's not as young as it used to be, is it? Yeah, it changes all the time. It changes from one week to the next week. It can change in 5 minutes. But yeah, it changes.
Okay, thanks. We'll move on to Rem.
Hey. So I've been in publications my whole career, magazines, and I've worked for a variety of magazines. Right now, as Steve said, I'm at the New York Times Magazine, which is great because it's a general interest magazine, so it's kind of a gumbo of all the magazines that I've worked for in the past, just because we cover a lot of different subjects. But this particular spread is from Spin Magazine. And Spin Magazine, for those of you who don't know, it is an alternative rock magazine. And I worked there for 2 years. And the goal with that magazine was to play with the demographics. Our age group was very young, but had a sophisticated eye. The big thing that we would always say is, as we were selling design to the editor-in-chief, who really wanted things just to be as simple as possible. She didn't want a lot of design in the magazine often, was that the eyes of the viewer are very sophisticated. They're on their laptops, they're on the internet, they're on their cell phones. So, they watch MTV. They're the MTV generation. So they understand the sophisticated nature of typography. So to me, it allowed us to take a lot more risks than other magazines wouldn't. For instance, one of the things that we did was there's not a traditional headline and deck. It's just the headline, which is hard to see, but it says Citizen Dave. Based off of Dave Matthews, the artist that we're covering. And there's no deck, there's no photography credit, there's nothing. It just says Citizen Dave. But, it just, to me, shows designers having a good time and playing, and I always felt like the reader could get that, could grasp that. And one of the things we did, we set out to shoot Dave Matthews. He's an interesting guy, great music, but he didn't want to play. He didn't want to do anything in terms of posing or anything conceptual. So he told us right from the jump, before we even set up the shoot, that he just wanted to do something really straightforward and just photograph him and put him in a beautiful scenic, and that's it. So the idea was, okay, well, let's shoot Dave Matthews, but also the photographer's Jeff Minton, but also let's go around to this great location and find other, environments that we can find that we thought might be interesting. So this just kind of happened by an accident, but the image on the left felt like a face to me, with the hair and whiskers and beards, and just felt like some weird nature monster. So I took that portrait of Dave Matthews and just put the photograph of the scenic next to him, and then just poked two little eyes in it.
We've looked at a lot of typography, which is pure type.
Yeah.
You call this typography, right? Because it's the blending of type and image?
Yeah, I would say, typography can be anything. It can be illustrative and decorative. It can be very simple, but it's just based on the decisions that one makes. And this one, again, it's just influenced by the photography with the colors and the sunset and the rhythm in his sweater and the stripes. I just created this pattern out of the typography, and it's not as difficult to read as it is there. It's hard to see it, but I just used a lot of different weights. I used the same font, which was avant-garde at the time, and just played off the photography. This one was pickup art. We didn't photograph them, and I just wanted to do something different. The photograph that I was given wasn't very interesting. I think it had a background, and I just silhouetted the artist, the white stripes, and I really wanted the design to take over, so I created this big W out of a font. It's really, I forget the name of the typeface, but it's actually two V's that I put together to form the W for the White Stripes, the band that we were talking about in the issue. So I just wanted to do something really slick and cool, and something that mirrored who these people are as artists.
Did you read it as W right away? Well, you did it. Of course you did. How many people read it as W? How many didn't? Which raises a question. There, you talked about the reader at the beginning, and I've been in magazines too, but no longer, thank God. And there was always that idea that the reader is out there somehow judging you from above.
Yeah.
And you've done so many wonderful things that if it was the reader sitting there in a focus group, you'd never have been able to get them done. But at what point do you decide what is reader-friendly and what is REM-friendly?
Well, first of all, focus groups are a nightmare, and for me, they're completely BS. I've sat in some. Not to get off the subject, but I sat in a focus group about coffee when I was really young, just to get money, to pay my bills, and I don't even drink coffee. So I don't think people are always honest in focus groups. But here, I really do think the reader would get that it's a W right away, because our readers, anyone that buys the magazine, it's not a magazine that you see on the newsstand and say, oh, I want this magazine. It looks interesting. I'll buy it. It's really like, people are into alternative music, so they buy it. So generally, I would say 98% of the reader knows who the White Stripes are, so therefore they would get the W right away. We took risks. We had fun. We weren't allowed, oddly enough, we weren't allowed to do profanity in the magazine, but yet they gave me a headline with profanity. So I didn't want to do a dingbat or anything, expected. So I just took these great photographs that Collier Short shot of Ryan Adams, and they were already silhouetted. I mean, she shot him against a white seamless, and then I just put the headline behind his head, and you can still see what the word is, but it's not blaring in your face. I just always thought that was odd, though, that they gave me that headline, but I figured out how to do it.
They were testing you.
Yeah, exactly. Oftentimes it's been, we would have these single-page openers, and in magazine land, that's really hard, because if you're doing a cover story with a single-page opener against an ad, it's hard to combine all the elements. You don't want to stick a photograph and a headline on that page. So oftentimes we would come up with illustrative type solutions. That was the rule for this page, just have fun with type. So this one was on an emo band. I forgot which band, but the headline was The Heartbreak Kid. So the little dots, again, it's hard to see. If you've traced them, they would form a heart. And then there's a little line that is that of a broken heart. So it's just kind of a simple dot-to-dot pattern, 1 through 50 or whatever the case may be. This was an illustration that I did for Wired magazine. The creative director, Scott Dadich, is really good about hiring magazine art directors to do illustrations for him, and I think that's kind of ironic that a magazine art director is doing an illustration for another magazine. But it's a fun project, and it's nice to kind of get out of the usual realm that we fall into. And this was a story in the front of the book about Ron Paul and how he was kind of one of the first to raise money on the internet. So I just kind of took that information and said, okay, what can I do? And I was influenced by coding, computer coding, and I just created this illustration just based on that idea, using an American flag as the motif. This one was fun. This was the college issue. We did this last year for the first time, and basically it's an issue dedicated to colleges and universities. But it's not the traditional thing like U.S. News and World Report where they rate colleges and all that. There really are. It's more thoughtful, and there are no ratings or anything like that. But the idea for the concept for this cover was, I went around, and a few of my designers went around, and we just photographed different scenes on college campuses. And one of the things that I found interesting in the summer at the end of the semester was the bulletin boards that had all the flyers ripped off, and you really couldn't see what anything was anymore. So that became the influence for this cover. And me and my team, we stayed up pretty much all night for a week straight, just designing fake flyers that you would see on college campuses, like cars for sale and looking for roommates. And then we also took outtakes from illustrations that appeared in the magazine and also outtakes from the photography. And we just ripped everything up and just had these big, huge piles of things, and we put it all together, and we came up with a solution that would work. So then I hired a stylist, and both of us put together this cover. It wasn't an easy thing to do. It took us 4 times to get it right. And the thing that I'm most proud about this, and I think a lot of people would appreciate in here, is that we didn't use Photoshop at all. It's all done by hand. There's nothing retouched about it. And that was the hard part, because I didn't want us to be able to say, okay, well, if you can't read the T, we'll just retouch it. That was the rule. Everything had to work. So the photographer was going crazy because, he was shooting digitally, and we just kept, okay, try it now, try it now. So we did about 50 or 60 takes before we got it right.
The other thing about this cover that I think is fascinating, when I read it as the collage issue.
Yeah. Ed Fella, who was a contributor in this issue, he called it that too. He would always say the collage issue, and it did work because we used that throughout. One of the things that we did was, there was this great magazine that was done called Fish Wrap at Art Center. And I was a huge fan of the magazine. It was done by students at the time. So I called up one of the professors, Lisa Wagner, at Art Center, and I said to her, look, I want you to put together an all-star team of designers that worked on Fish Wrap, and I want them to do the headlines for the college issue. So we put together about 7 or 8 people. She showed me their books and their work, and then we worked with them, and we art directed them as if they were illustrators, and it was great fun. This one was the title page for the issue, and the idea was, let's create the title page out of books, different books. So this was this year, actually, or 2008. So this was the second issue of the college issue. We do one every year. And what's great about this is we took it a step further, and we decided that anyone that did the art in the magazine had to be a currently enrolled college student or graduate student. And that was a huge risk, because the photography, the illustration, the typography, everything was done by college students. And I became almost like a professor, like just, working with them, not so much as an art director, but as a teacher, because students tend to be a little more sensitive, and they're not used to the commercial aspects of the business yet. So this student was great. He created, we gave him the idea, and he created it out of all the books that he had. And we did cheat a little bit with this, because his library wasn't that big yet, so he had to repeat a few books, so we changed the colors of the books just so you wouldn't see that.
Now, did they all come to you, or did you do this long distance with them? How did you?
No. They were college students from all over the world. So, the great thing about technology now is you have the internet, and that's how, we would call college professors and ask them to recommend people, and that got a little weird. A lot of times the professors didn't want to recommend their students for some reason. I don't know why.
They wanted the job.
They wanted the job, yeah. So we had to really do the research, and one of my designers, Hillary Greenbaum, who's great at researching, she found a lot of the artists, or designers rather, and then we would send them emails and ask if they wanted to do it. And most of the students were really excited, but some of them they wanted to do it, but they wanted to establish the rules before they accepted the job. It was really funny.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they already had their little attitudes. So this one was the green issue. We do this every year now, 2008 being the first year we did it. This was the inaugural issue. And we hired the San Francisco-based artist named Ginge Lakey to do the typography for us. And what's great about her is that she works with all natural material, which that's one of the rules of her artwork. So it fit in perfectly with the theme of the issue. So she created all these great headlines out of different natural material. This isn't in order, but it's my fault, because you asked me if I needed an order, and I said no. But this was done by Sam Winston, an artist out of London, and he works just with type. He creates artwork out of type. And the story was about how the internet is introducing new words to the English dictionary constantly. So we thought it would be appropriate to find an artist who works just with typography and have him do some illustrations for us. And when we do this, I have this great editor who understands when we hire an artist to do this kind of thing, there are no rules. You have to let them do what they do. And as long as they're not using profanity or anything, that's not appropriate for the New York Times Magazine, and as long as they understand that they have to spell the words correctly, because it does have to go through our copy department, they can do whatever they want. And this was a great assignment that showed that. This was from the college issue too. It's a story about why Teach for America, and how a lot of students, commit to this program, become teachers and actually become great teachers, but then they don't commit. They stay for 2 years, whatever the requirement is, and then they go off to medical school. And it was kind of a story about what kind of effect that has on students in the long term, or what kind of effect it has with schools in the long term. So Alan Dodd did the illustration on the left, and it's hard to see, but in each of the dots, it's a different profession, lawyer, doctor, pharmacist, whatever the case may be. And this was the opening to that story that I just discussed 2 slides ago. This one, again, is from the college issue, and this was great. This guy was, he was traveling around the country at the time with his girlfriend when we hired him, and he would pull off on the side of the road and come up with these great headlines, and then take a digital camera or his iPhone, I guess, and shoot it, and then send it to us right away and say, oh, what do you think of this? And they were all just beautiful. I didn't understand how he was able to do that. Sometimes he would actually do this stuff in the car. And everything that he sent us, I mean, most of this stuff needed heavy art direction, but everything that he sent us, I mean, it was perfect. The hardest part was trying to figure out which headline we would go with. And we ended up going with this one, which was done in watercolor. This was a cover that we did in-house, and this story was about foreign policy and how the Supreme Court in the future is going to have to deal more globally than, and internationally more than just in this country. So we created the globe out of different words. These, we created these little almost like pixels, these little colored boxes, and we put words inside of them that just were words that the Supreme Court will have to deal with. Again, it's hard to read, but all of those are little words within the colored boxes. This was our money issue. We do about 8 themed issues every year. And one of the themed issues that we do is it's called the money issue. And within those themes, there are different subjects. So this one was how New York has changed over the past 10 years and has become, as you all know, a very wealthy city. So the influence behind the typography and the design was really money. A lot of modern money now, they have these beautiful intricate patterns that are used to counter counterfeiters, but they're also beautiful. So we decided to let that be the influence for the issue, and we created all these beautiful patterns just based on what you see on bills. This is a sneak peek at a cover that's coming out next week. My editor gave me permission to show it today. But we're doing this portfolio of Obama's administration, all photographs, no stories, no text, and it was shot by Nadav Kander. And I really wanted the cover to be something timeless and classic. I tried all of these things. I tried black backgrounds with blends and really ornate typography, and I just kept coming back to something really simple. And I just wanted to know, what will this cover look like in 50 years? Will people look at it and say, oh, yeah, that was done in 2008, or 9 rather, or will they look at it and not really put a date to it, but just realize that it's an important moment in time? And that's really what I was trying to get at. And I just kept it as simple as possible, and we were happy with it.
What is that title of this?
It's Champion Gothic. Condensed. Champion Gothic.
And
Is that an old?
That was done by Jonathan Hoffler. I'm not sure what year, but it's relatively new.
within the last 5 years.
Yeah, within the last 5 years.
It looks like.
What about the text inside? Is it similarly austere?
Yeah, very simple. There's not a lot of text because it's a 52-page portfolio of just photography. The only text is really the names of the administration members and their titles.
So one thing you didn't show here, but I'm sure anybody who's a frequent reader of the magazine section has come across, you do for the on-language column, the Sapphire column.
I wish I had brought that, yeah. You said 5 to 10 pieces.
My fault. But what you do there is you have them illustrate the title in a variety of different ways. Are you finding that there's more of this kind of interpretive typography going on now? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, the funny thing is, and you even said it with kind of how did you describe it, the disappearing of magazines or whatever the case may be. We've been doing this now. We're almost to our 200th anniversary, meaning we've hired 200 people to do the Sapphire column. And everyone has done something different, and everyone has a different approach. Some people may have in their portfolio very simple typography like this, but they decide to hand letter it. Some people may be the opposite. You never know what you're going to get. That's what's great about it. And the rule for that section is we can't art direct it too much. Whatever the people turn in, unless it's god-awful, and that hasn't happened too often, or it's inappropriate. But the rule is it just has to be legible, and people follow that rule, and they come up with some beautiful things. And You know, it's hard to see because in what I do, I mean, I teach as well at SVA, and I talk to my young students. And when I started last year, I assumed that a lot of them would be headed toward becoming internet designers, working in that realm, but all of them want to work in print. And the question they have is always, well, when is print going to end? When is it going to happen? Should I do it or should I not? And I always say, well, how am I supposed to know? I mean, I don't know. No one knows. I don't have a magic globe in front of me. But you know, I mean, even these young designers realize the importance of print and paper and doing things by hand, like you mentioned. And you know, hopefully it doesn't die. But what I'm witnessing, it's not. I mean, you know, I had one student who did an entire magazine this semester by hand, and it was great. It was beautiful. Wow. Yeah.
How much of a concern is it when you design something, what the emotional reaction of the person who looks at it is?
I mean, that's a huge concern. It's tough at the New York Times Magazine because our demographics are so broad. I mean, we have readers that are in their 20s, and we have readers that are in their 90s. So, I mean, one of the complaints that I get often from the older readers is sometimes the type is too small. You know, and we even have had requests to print it in larger format, like Reader's Digest. But it's very important to me. I always try to think about that, about the reader and how they're going to react to something. And on the other hand, I try not to be too safe all of the time either, because you know I want to surprise people. And when we get letters in with people that are pissed off and people that are happy, you know, to me that's success, because you're at least evoking emotion out of people, and you're not just doing something boring and simple and beige.
Well, you don't set up with the idea that I'm going to do this cover, and the emotion I want to create in whoever looks at it is happiness or austerity or sadness.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like even the college issue that we did with the bulletin board, I wanted people to look at that and say, oh, wow, you know, I remember those days when, you know, at the end of the semester, that was one of the signs that it was all ending and summer was beginning. I mean, yeah, those we certainly take those into account.
The question I have for you is a kind of simple one. Why did you do this film, Helvetica?
That's a good question. It's fun that I'm on this panel with all of you, because I've spent the last year of my life trying to not think about typography. Because it was about a 2-year process of making the film, and by the end of that process and through touring the film and doing screenings, I had developed full-blown typomania, which is a recognized psychological disorder.
Is it?
Yeah.
Is it a recognized psychological
It's
disorder?
also serious.
Very serious.
It's when you look at a billboard or a sign and the first thing you do is identify the typeface. Before you even read what it says, you're like, oh, is that Franklin Gothic? Or oh, the G's wrong or something. Because after spending 2 years looking for Helvetica, it's hard to turn that off. So I'm just now coming out of recovery. And, I'm detoxing, exactly.
And has this...
To that condition now of looking at typeface in a new way. That's what art is about, though, making it.
Yeah. Well, that's one thing. I mean, people who've seen the film who aren't necessarily graphic designers have, I think they definitely walk out of the theater and notice all the type that's in the environment, which is kind of one of the things that I guess I was trying to do with the film. But I'm I'm not a graphic designer, and I don't consider myself an artist, but I'm definitely the Macintosh generation. I mean, when I was in college, the first Macintosh came out, and I immediately started using one, not to specifically do design, but to just let me publish books or make posters for my friend's band or record covers or whatever it was that we were doing at the time. And that ability to take something, me with no art background, to be able to take some crazy idea that I had for an event or a company or whatever it was, and to just get on the Macintosh and set it into type and then print it out. And suddenly it was real. It was a real thing. Which is something you couldn't
have done before the Macintosh.
Exactly.
Except with Crest type.
Exactly, which I have no aptitude for. So.
But you also, this was your first real movie as well.
Yeah.
So you jump into typography, which you knew nothing about, and you did a movie.
Well, again, starting in those like the late 80s and early 90s when the Mac and desktop publishing and kind of fonts were becoming more part of people's knowledge. I've always admired good graphic design and great type design, and I started publishing books. I had an independent publishing house in the mid '90s, so that's when I really got involved in typography and started learning about people like Herbert Bayer and the Bauhaus and the other modernist type designers, and just sort of gaining an appreciation for that went through the 90s all the way up to now. So when I got involved in first distributing documentaries and helping friends produce music documentaries, I just wanted to see a documentary about type and about type design and about what typography and how it affects us. So that was why I made the film, and I thought it would just be a good way to meet a lot of interesting designers too.
What have you learned about?
If you ever want to meet really interesting people, just make a documentary about them, because then they'll normally they won't give you the time of day, but if you're making a documentary, suddenly they're oh, of course, yeah.
So you don't even have to make the documentary; you just tell them
you don't exactly. Just you even turn the camera on. You can just set the camera up and then have a so and there you go.
This is good. Don't use this.
We may need him for fundraising.
So what have you learned about Helvetica I mean, doing a film like this for as many years as you worked on it, it's an educative process. What did you learn? What did you learn that may have changed your attitudes?
Well, I think the whole modernist, postmodernist kind of divide was something that I knew a little bit about, but I really wasn't aware of how passionate people were about it, and not just about Helvetica. Really, Helvetica is just a stand-in for kind of different philosophies about graphic design and about type. So that was interesting. I mean, you can read. There weren't a lot of filmed interviews with these designers that were already available, so I didn't really have anything to go off of. You can read an interview with somebody and kind of get an idea of what their opinions are going to be, but then you get there, it's completely different. So, I mean, things like, I didn't plan on traveling to Münchenstein, Switzerland, but it just kind of we were kind of of course you've got to go find the place where it was born. And actually Tobias Frere-Jones, amazing type designer, helped me because he had a lot of old specimen books that had the old address, and we got on Google Maps and we kind of located the building, and then explored around outside of Basel and found the building. But So I think I learned a lot about the history of Helvetica and about type in the 20th century that I didn't necessarily set out to do. I don't think I was going to get into the kind of historical angle of the typeface. But once I started the project, that's just sort of people were like, oh, you have to go talk to, Matthew Carter or whoever it was.
Elaine mentioned that in the film, it really wasn't discussed about Helvetica as a text face, as Helvetica is something that goes on a page, and it's certainly the Swiss used it in their magazine Neue Grafik.
Yeah,
Neue Grafik.
That's a whole other documentary. I mean, it's just there's too much to talk about, which is the funny thing.
It's one of the sequel.
Exactly.
He has a sequel. You want to give away the name?
There's no sequel.
No, tell him.
No, well, if there is a sequel, it's got to be called like Helvetica 2, The Revenge of the Serif. Be like all the or a Comic Sans movie. That's the other thing. It could be good, but yeah.
Well, we have hit 4:14, which means we've been here for 2 days, I think. And I'd like to just throw it open if we can.
I just wanted to say one thing before. I want to thank Ann Catania, who's sitting right over there, because this was your idea, actually. And this is a lot of the way Philoctetes works. People who are involved with us. Ann's been on a lot of our panels, and she's the dramaturg at Lincoln Center, and I'm very proud to know her. And I was an old friend of hers from Yale. And it just came up. She said, you ought to try. She said, she mentioned Tamar, and it all came about. And that's how the whole thing starts. People sort of say things, and that's how these projects come about, actually. So take it away.
Well, I'd like to leave it open for a few questions from the audience.
Sure.
Okay.
Come on up. You got to come up to the microphone because we record you.
There's one here.
My name is Larry Cutler. I'd like to ask Mr. Hustwit, how were you able to get so much power into this movie and the music that went with it and the characters, all these different characters, and it was a work of art. And I know nothing about this
Thank you.
typography. I know a little about literacy. I can read. But it was beautiful and it was so powerful. And I want to know how you did it.
It's interesting when you're interviewing people, and granted, these are amazing artists and brilliant people and really creative and really love what they do, and that comes through. The passion that they all have comes through, and when you're sitting down across the table from someone and you're interviewing them, they're also keying off you too, because they're looking into your eyes, and if they realize that, I really want to know this stuff. I'm not there covering it for, a news crew or something. Like, I'm spending my own money to fly to, Munchenstein to interview them, and that gets them, riled up, and they really want to talk, and they really get involved in the process. And making a documentary, it's about capturing that, not only what they say, but how they're saying it, and making sure that comes through again to the people that are in turn watching, because now they're looking at that person's face and they're cueing off of how they feel. So that's, I guess, I hopefully answered the question. I know, but then the music was just a lot of things that I was listening to on my iPod when I was making the film and walking around the streets looking at type on a billboard, and a bus would drive by and I'd be listening to those songs, and it's a direct representation of what I was doing during the process of making the film. So
The masses were there too. That was part of it too.
yeah.
Can we get another question?
Yes.
Laurie, go ahead.
This is a question for Rem.
Yes.
As a lifelong reader of the Times Magazine section, I've noticed recently that what has happened is that you have these wonderful double truck spreads with a couple of words and big pictures, and then double pages of blocks of type, whereas before it used to be that the pictures were scattered into the text. Mm-hmm. And I'm fascinated by that in an era when they're telling us that people won't sit still for more than 200 or 300 words of text in a block, online or in print.
Sure.
Where do you come off making that decision?
How dare you?
Yeah. Well, a lot of it, creating a magazine is a team effort. So the directive is that, my editor, Jerry Marzorati, really believes that people still do read. And he certainly believes that people read the New York Times Magazine because he believes in the content. So, it really is a space issue. A lot of times we don't have the luxuries of creating, a 6-page story with a lot of photographs sprinkled through. Sometimes it is just about the written word. So, decisions have to be made on how to accommodate the text. So there's really no science or formula to it. A lot of it is just fitting in the words.
But segregating the imagery and the display type from the body type.
Yes. We don't do it often, but we don't do it all the time, but we do it a lot, just to accommodate the text.
Noticing it more.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Yeah, Elaine, you touched on this during one of the exchanges, the different challenges in typography from a block of text versus a billboard or some of the title pages we saw. If you could elaborate upon that, as no one in particular, but just as a group, the different challenges on whether printed or on screen between a block of text and titles and billboards and posters and stuff.
Excuse me. Well, I have not. I'm really losing my voice. I'm sorry. I haven't done that kind of typography since the 60s, so I really wouldn't know how you do it today. I know how you do it, but I'm not sure I could do it in the same way. When I was doing a page of type or designing a book, every instruction would be written, and in a sense, one had to visualize the color of the page as you were doing it, and you would make a little sketch, but basically it had to be in your head because you couldn't try it. So what you would do is you would specify every little piece. It would usually be 2 typewritten pages. And you'd start out with the title page, the content, giving every instruction, the width, the leading. I always was very careful about the size and the leading, because I think that's almost the most important thing, how it looks on the page. One of the areas of reading on the page that always bothers me, and I don't know how one solves this, is when you open a book, when there's very little space in the gutter, why they don't put that space on the outside so you can open the book and read it. I mean, I always tried to do that. With paperbacks, it was very difficult because they're so small. But these are the kind of things that, you know, I used to think about. Now, I'm not sure how you think about it on the screen, because you can immediately print it out, but I don't know if designers do this. I mean, when they do it on the screen and specify it, do you print it out to see it?
Do you?
Do you?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know who said it, but I certainly agree.
No, I meant you have to really see it.
No, you do, absolutely, yeah. Without
Now,
question.
we couldn't see it. We were thinking about it and guessing. And what would come back from the typesetter were long galleys on, what was that paper called? Just,
Well, there was kind of acid, not acetate.
no,
but
no,
the
it was,
tissue paper.
no.
You would get acetate, though, depending where you ordered it from.
It
No,
was
it,
galley paper.
Yeah.
it was what you used in kindergarten to newsprint.
Oh, pulp.
Oh,
right.
it was really yellow newsprint.
Right.
But you would have to also, you know, you would have to figure out the whole book. You'd have to count all the words. If there was, you'd have to tell when the italics were, I mean, everything. Explain with picas or measurements where the page numbers were. It was a different time.
Could I also jump in about that? Because we've totally focused on display
That's right.
lettering. I mean, that's what we've been talking about. That's what we looked at. The art of setting text is a really very specific craft. And there it's much more about pure legibility. I mean, if you're going to read a book, then you better get the line length right, because if it's too long and you're always losing your place when you come back, no one's going to want to read the book. And I think that's where the rules come in kind of really strongly.
It also requires more literacy. I mean, doing display, you don't have to read.
No.
You have to feel. And people do read, and designers write headlines. But
And sometimes misspelled.
yes. But in casting out a book, you really are forced to read and make sure that, as you say, the line lengths are correct, the leading is correct, the word spacing is correct.
Right, and that you get even color. You mentioned the word color, which
Very-
refers specifically to the how dark a line of type is, what the balance between black and white is. You want an even color down a column of text. That doesn't come into display type, but you want your pages to look even.
We have another question, and I think it'll have to be the last.
In both the display typography that we've seen today and the calligraphy, there seems to be an interplay between assigned formal structures or types and your own contribution and artistic kind of a vision. Is that part of the creative process in working in both these forms?
In everything.
Actually, that's true.
In everything. If you're an artist, a designer, you make clothes. I mean, if you're in the field of making, that has to occur.
So it's not unique about these forms?
No, I think if you're designing shoes,
But,
shoelaces, anything.
But in every form, there are those people who do it unthinkingly and work with templates, and that's, you know, when you get the Chinese menu, or something, or stuff that, you know, packaging that looks like a Chinese menu. And some Chinese menus are quite nice, but you know, there are more and more formulas now for people to follow.
But explaining the creative process is, that's another session.
Right.
There's one person who's been waiting a long time to
I
ask.
have a quick question for Gareth about the film. I was wondering if you reached out to anyone at Apple or Microsoft with regards to having them choosing their default.
Yeah, well, I tried to, but I didn't really, like, at one point I had interview Steve Jobs on my, like, to-do list, but that never actually, never actually happened. But I've since talked a lot to people more about that, and I think the people at Linotype, actually on the DVD, one of the extras is about Linotype and Apple and how that decision to license Helvetica for the Macintosh was made. So I've heard lots of stories. I've heard stories that Steve Jobs audited a class in typography that his girlfriend was taking in college, and when he wanted one thing I've heard was when they originally came up with the Macintosh and the whole kind of desktop publishing era started, they wanted real fonts, real typefaces on there, not just made up ones, so that professionals would take it seriously because it had the Helvetica and Times New Roman and things like that. So I think that was an important choice because it did make the Macintosh synonymous with the graphic design, and the professionals. It became a professional tool as well as something that anybody could get on and make a type design with. So.
See, if we had one gentleman here, one final, very short question. Do you want to step to the microphone?
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to ask the question. I heard you say that you're going to make the follow-up something about the serif.
I was just joking.
Are you serious? You're joking, or are you going to make the follow-up?
No, I was really joking. I'm definitely not going to make
in
the
the hope
follow-up.
of seeing the follow-up, I'm not from America, but the next year would be the 10th year that I'm in the United States, and I make a point of traveling around, and I got the pulse of America, and I found that there's quite often a tendency to be very technicist about even technology. But there's an extent to which technology is a component to it, and I think she touched on it and she very much with the Arabic writing style. And that's the spiritual aspect, but also the ideological aspect of it. And I was wondering whether you can elucidate a little bit about that in the follow-up movie.
Follow-up.
How many want a follow-up? Just get money.
Further information about our programs and a complete archive of past Philoctetes events is available at philoctetes.org.